Hello students, and welcome to this week's topic, which is all about differentiating assessment. We've been leading up to this week with understanding different types of assessment: formative, performance, summative assessment. But this week we're going into, do you have to give the same assessment for all students in your class? And if not, how can you differentiate assessment? First of all, it's important to understand why we need to differentiate assessment, and it's all about student diversity. Many of our classrooms are just not homogeneous anymore. You might have lots of different types of students from different backgrounds, speaking different languages. And so we have to really not only differentiate instruction for the needs of those students, but differentiate how we assess learning. Lates and Billings in 1995 said, "It's just good teaching." There's been a significant increase of inclusion classrooms, defined as an increase in English language learners, or we call them ELs, as well as students of disabilities. And we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about classifications and what you can do later in this presentation. We're going to talk in depth about legal ramifications and for different types of students. And we're going to touch on services for gifted or advanced students. First of all, let's consider the types of diversity that might occur in a classroom. You might have diversity of ability. You might have some very advanced students and others that are suffering from cognitive impairment, for example. You might have students who have sensory or physical impairment. So, for example, they're missing a limb. You might have students with learning disabilities, such as dyslexia or the reversal of letters. You might have students who are struggling to put their attention or focus on an assignment, as well as other ways that students can be diverse in terms of their the ability to emotionally control themselves. Impulsivity plays into it, different languages spoken, different types of culture. And here's an important one: the previous educational experiences are not all the same that students bring to the classroom. Just a little bit about the background on assessing students with special needs in terms of the legal mandates. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, or what is known as Public Law 94-142, led to mainstreaming and later inclusion. In 1986, this law was extended to not only include K-12 students, but preschoolers, 3 to 5-year-olds. In 1990, it became the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or what we call IDEA, which led to requirements for students for individualized education plans, or IEP. In 1992, the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, was amended in 1997, and this one focuses on accessibility. So in terms of providing fair instruction and assessment, how do you take a student, for example, with a learning disability such as dyslexia, and make sure that you're teaching that student well and assessing that student appropriately? So what does all this mean for identification in special education? It means that placement in special programs or qualifications for specialized services must be non-discriminatory. And there are 4 precepts that go along with this. It has to be done by trained personnel. So when you identify students, you have to have a multidisciplinary team. So you might have the classroom teacher, you might have a special education teacher, a guidance counselor, the parent, etc. You must assess specific areas of educational need and not just IQ. So it's not just enough to give students an IQ test, but you use other assessments such as cognitive assessments and emotional assessments to understand the student's learning needs. The test must not discriminate against the child's disability. So you can't give a test, a heavy written test, for example, to a student that has a heavy reading disability. And finally, there must be multiple procedures or forms of identification. That means you have to be able to give multiple assessments, checklists, screenings, other types of tests or measurements to accurately diagnose what's going on with the student. IDEA set up certain classifications of disabilities, and the ones you see on the screen here are some of the most common ones, and they're discussed in your text as well. There are others, but this is probably 90% of what you'll see as a teacher. The first is mild mental retardation. That is usually defined as a low IQ. Usually it's one or more standard deviations below average, which is 100. And deficits in adaptive behaviors needed for normal functioning. So you might have a student who exhibits a low IQ who is unable to read. You need to be careful, though, when you're thinking about this, because what you're diagnosing as a problem with adaptive behaviors might just be a cultural issue. It might be that they can't read because they don't know English, for example. Many ELL students have been diagnosed informally by their teachers as low IQ when in fact they're very high IQ and functioning, but they just don't know the language. Sensory impairment problems include vision, hearing, or speech deficits. Physical impairments such as amputation, muscular dystrophy. Learning disabilities is defined as a disorder in the ability to understand spoken or written language. Emotional disturbances are sometimes called behavioral disorders, and there are various categories of these. You can see them on page 315 of your text. And finally, attention deficits, difficulty staying focused, and the three that we know most often are ADD, ADHD, and hyperactivity. This is just a summary of the steps that you as a regular classroom teacher would need to be involved with in identifying students for special education. You would do an initial assessment. You would try some modifications. You would write up a diagnosis of specific difficulties. If these didn't help, you might bring that write-up to the small group review. This might consist of a team that's starting to do, for example, research to intervention, trying different strategies that are research-based and seeing how they work. You might take it further, if that doesn't work, to pre-referrals, instructional interventions, and formal referrals. At this point, the team would get involved. You might have the school psychologist, for example, do an IQ test, and there would be other specialists that come in and do some more formalized assessment to diagnose cognitive disabilities or emotional disabilities. And that might lead to formal identification for special education services. At that point, the student would most likely receive an individualized education plan with learning objectives, and there would be a team working to make sure that student receives specialized services. So what is your role in this process? In the pre-referral process, you want to document and monitor, communicate with the parents and the team members, and implement any pre-referral interventions that you might want to try. If that doesn't work, you're going to be able to recognize specific characteristics and diagnose what could potentially be going on, write it up, and send it for a formal referral. At that point, there will be a documentation of the student's strengths, limitations. There will be work samples collected, a consultation with the team. Referral forms will be completed, child study meetings, etc. If you look at page 317 in your text, there's an excellent table of the types of questions you might be asking yourself if you suspect one of these types of disabilities. It's kind of a nice guide for you to, so if you're thinking about a student that might have one, you think might have one of the disabilities that I've mentioned, check out that page and ask yourself the questions about that student. There's some problems when we try to assess the learning of students with disabilities. And they generally break down into these categories. Comprehension, sometimes it's difficult to know what students know. Sometimes they are reluctant or embarrassed to volunteer or ask questions. Auditory or visual, sometimes they're having trouble hearing or reading instructions. They may have trouble with time constraints. They might get very anxious or embarrassed and need extended time. And finally, students may exhibit certain behaviors at some times and not others. So they may have variable behavior. So it might be difficult to pin down what the problem is. We're going to talk about a number of accommodations that students may have written into their IEPs and the things you can do to accommodate assessment. The first is the environment. So it's important to limit distractions in your classroom. That's both in terms of visual distractions and also in terms of the sound that's going on, because even the tiniest of sounds, if a child has a sensory disability, can become very loud and distracting. Or if ADHD, to an ADHD student, a pencil dropping on the floor might distract that student. So try to limit visual, lots of clutter in the room, and also keep the environment quiet. Make sure that you safeguard the student's privacy about the accommodation, so no stigma. So you don't want to say, Bobby, I need you to go to the far corner of the room because of your accommodation. You want this to be invisible and transparent to the other students. And as much as possible, keep the testing environment low stress. So you can, just like with the math article you read a couple of weeks ago, allow students to talk about it, write about it, discuss their anxiety levels, to reassure them that it's not going to be, they can be successful, that they have been taught the material, and that it won't be the end of the world if they don't do a perfect job. As far as directions, there's some important test accommodations to consider. Your directions, just like in the assignments we've been doing, need to be straightforward, clear, and brief. Many students struggle with multi-step directions, so it's useful to write down one direction for each sentence and each sentence on a separate line. So, for example, instead of running your directions together in a paragraph, you could say, number 1, read the paragraph below. Number 2, underline the important words. Number 3, etc. You should put directions in when they're needed, not all at the beginning. So just like when you did your selected response quiz, you didn't put all the directions for true, false, and multiple choice and everything at the top of the test. You scattered them throughout. You put the true, false in where the true, false needed to be and the multiple choice directions there. Same thing here. Just when they need the directions, that's when you should write them. There are a number of formatting considerations, and if you look at page 323, you can see some good examples of formatting. Read them out loud. I used to do this with my students, and I found it very helpful. Some of those are just auditory processors, and if you just leave them, and with the written directions, they don't understand them, but if you read them out loud, it really helps. Always allow time at the beginning of the test for questions. Students might have a number of them that might surprise you. You can provide examples, sometimes even written on the test, for how to answer. Or you can do this at the beginning of the test. This is frequently done with standardized testing, where the makers of the test will actually build in a set of instructions and an example problem that you lead the students through. And finally, always check for understanding. Do students understand how to go about answering the questions on the test? You could have students repeat it back to you. Common adaptations are found on page 326 of your test, so I'll let you review that for administration. Basically, you want, again, to keep the room quiet. You want to allow extended time for students who need extended time, etc. And speaking of extended time, there are several ways to do that. You could say, okay, you can have 30 minutes or you can have 60 minutes. You can double the time. Usually in the IEP, there's a guideline for how much extended time the student gets. You can allow students to take breaks during long exams. You can give frequent short tests rather than longer tests, and you can allow for retakes. We've spent some time in the class talking about the format of test questions, especially with selected construction, true, false, multiple choice, etc. This slide talks about how to do formatting for constructed response questions. So those questions where students have to write an answer. If you have a student who is allowed to have this, a really good way to scaffold that student in short answers is to provide a word bank or some other. So you might say, write an answer to this question and make sure you use all the words in the box below. You can also use sentence prompts. So instead of just expecting them to come up with a short answer from scratch, you could give them sentences and ask them to write the words that go into the blank. So for example, if you were giving a short answer to the question, what does it mean to revolve around a planetary body, you could have a sentence that said, a planetary body that revolves blanks another planetary body, and the answer would be goes around. Graphic prompts are very much the same way, little hints about what does the graphic mean. Essay, so some of you used an essay on your performance assessment, and a lot of you got the comment, you need to have a graphic organizer. Regular students have trouble writing essays and other types of written responses without some type of organizer to help them record their research and organize their thoughts. Sentence prompts and graphic prompts are also appropriate for essays. It's okay to give these students with the IEPs a separate type of test with these helping aids and to give other students less aid. Here's an example of directions that are written well for an essay. You can see the directions are one step at a time. It breaks it out into the context and the task. Words are bolded and even italicized to draw attention. Here's an example of a DBQ graphic organizer for a secondary education, I believe it's a history writing task. And again, very specific, broken out, line by line instructions. We can make accommodations in grading, and in fact this may be required by the student's IEP. When you're thinking about grading, some teachers balk at this because they think, well, if I grade differently for this student, it means I'm being easier on this student. And I want you to think in terms of mastery of the IEP learning objectives. So a good way to do this is think about how far or what level of mastery has the student accomplished the IEP objectives, and then assign a grade. So if the student hasn't mastered many objectives or hasn't made as much progress towards them as previously you thought they did, or they did last grading period, they might get a C. If they've done more, they might get a B. It's important not to say, okay, he has 10 learning objectives and he's mastered 5 of them, I'm going to give him a 50%. That's not the way it works. Think about each learning objective has a sort of like a level of rubric, and where is that student on mastering that particular objective. You can also compare them to district standards. A really good way to accommodate grading, though, is through development of a contract. There's a really good example in your book on page 330. In a contract, the teacher and student enter into this contract, and it specifies the level of work that must be done for particular grades. So it's tied in again to the IEP learning objectives, and you might say, to get a B, I agreed to do this, this, and this on my learning objectives, or to master this, and to get an A, I have to do more. And so student signs it, teacher signs it, usually the parent signs it, and that becomes a very concrete guideline for the student's grade in the class. And finally, rubrics are good old friends. If properly done, they assess levels required for a grade, and you can actually have a separate rubric for students with disabilities. You can make accommodations in reporting. Some you have to check with your district. Sometimes they will allow other types of progress reports, such as checklists, narrative summary, which flesh out the areas of strength, or even graphs. So, for numerical scores, you can do a line graph to show how the student's progress has been. It's important to consider alternatives to testing, and the IEP might allow this. So it can be a rich tool, especially for younger students. It can motivate students. There are all kinds of online alternatives to testing that allow for utilization of technology. And you may even offer students 3 different ways to demonstrate mastery and let them choose one. And that becomes very important to allow student choice. Examples of alternative assessment might be timelines, books, cartoon strips, play, models, really a lot of things. We've talked about portfolios and performance assessments, as well as interactive notebooks. We haven't spent a lot of time talking about interactive notebooks. Basically, think of an interactive notebook as a place where students record their responses to learning, and the teacher writes back to the student, makes a comment, and the student might respond to the teacher's comment. So it's a back and forth. That's why it's called interactive, but it also documents student learning. Let's switch gears for a minute now and talk about English language learners, or ELLs, in inclusive settings. We've known now for a long time that it's best to use an inclusive model, and that is teaching students who are English learners, language learners, in the regular classroom. But what surprises teachers is that the understanding that it might take 5 to 7 years for that student to demonstrate average proficiency in English. English is a really difficult language to learn, and the older you are when you come in, the more difficult it appears to be. This doesn't mean that students aren't intelligent. It just means that they are having trouble with the language, and that's like a roadblock. ELLs, just like students with disabilities, have a legal right to an adequate education. There are certain factors influencing ELL assessment. So, for example, language and literacy skill factors. It's pretty commonly known that language problems mask content, knowledge, and skills. So if I can't understand what you're asking for, or I don't know the words for the tools, I may not necessarily be able to demonstrate proficiency on a skill level. Educational background factors vary tremendously with ELL students. For example, I used to teach in Florida, and there was a large population of migrant children who would come in and out for part of the year simply because they were the children of the families that would move in to pick the orange crops. And so those students move around all through the year, resulting in a great deal of variability in their educational backgrounds. You might find other cultural factors. So different cultures view competition differently, for example, than we do in the United States. Some might be more collaborative and shun competition. Others might be more competitive. Different views of plagiarism. They might not see it as plagiarism because in their culture they may value using the contributions of others and adding to the contributions of others. So it's important to explain all of this to your students and understand where they're at in terms of cultural factors. You can make a number of accommodations for ELLs on assessments, including test format, simplifying the language, giving them English to Spanish or English to their home language dictionaries, limiting selected response answers, allowing alternative ways to answer on constructed response, providing scaffolding, You can look at all of these on page 336. You can accommodate on test-taking procedures, as we've talked about before, by giving extra time, flexible scheduling, providing breaks, and giving a second chance. And finally, you can evaluate their performance and provide feedback, focusing on content separately from language. So a common practice is to have 2 grades, one on content knowledge and another on writing, for example, if you're doing an essay. And this at least gives feedback that, yes, I understand, the student understands the content. A third category I'd like to discuss today is accommodations that can be made for advanced or gifted students. Now, gifted programs vary greatly across the nation, and unlike with students with disabilities, it is not covered under IDEA. So there's no legal right at the national level for gifted students to have different curriculum. But it's good pedagogy anyway. A lot of times you'll have gifted students who come in and they know what's going to be taught in class, and many times we'll see one of 2 things happen. They'll turn off and tune out. And sometimes this results in misbehavior. It can result in a disengagement from school. And even more harmfully, we see higher dropout rates in advanced and gifted students as they enter high school because they're bored. So it's good pedagogy to be able to challenge these students. And our recommendation is, if students have mastered your regular objectives, provide higher level learning. So what that might mean, for example, is if they come in knowing 2-digit times 2-digit multiplication, give them harder multiplication problems and teach them how to do it. In math, a really good thing to do is to use worksheets that have gradually more difficult problems on them. And you can say to students as a pre-assessment, try to do these problems, go as far as you think you're able, and then bring your sheet to me. And you can very quickly tell where they are at in the skill level. So then you can divide them up and give them appropriate learning material for where they're at in their skill level. If you teach them more advanced content, it's extremely appropriate and important to adapt the assessment of that content. So you wouldn't want to be teaching 4 students how to do 4-digit by 4-digit multiplication, but only assess them on 2-digit by 2-digit multiplication. So if you have higher learning objectives, you can give alternate homework and you can give alternate tests. If students have not yet mastered your learning objectives, but are capable of mastering them quickly, what you can do is move them quickly through it and provide less what we call scaffolding. So what would that look like? It might be fewer instructions, it might be more independent work, and so they gradually have to master the learning objectives, but maybe they get a little less help. Once they've mastered the learning objectives, put them into something harder, and then provide that assessment for the harder material. Test when they're ready, instead of lockstep, and move on to higher level assessments. So in your case study this week that you're going to read and post about on the discussion board, I want you to think about some of these strategies and see if you could incorporate some of them. Tell me what you think about them and incorporate some of them in the discussion, and we'll see how that works out. So everybody, have a great week, and we're almost at the end of the course, so yay, you stuck it out. And I will be doing some information on the final exam, either in this module or the next learning module. So see you next week.